Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more Esoterica. Today we're diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Mysterium, Conjuntionis. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above. In the box down below, along with the original source material, the link for my book where I teach you most of these things anyway, and the links to get in contact with me or support the channel directly so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of the Mysterium Conjunctios with Chapter 5, Part 9, the third stage, the Unus Mundus. The unification of the earth, right? Alright, so the production of the lapis was the goal of alchemy in general. Dorn was a significant exception because for him this denoted only the completion of the second stage of the conjunction. In this, he agrees with the psychological experience. We have talked before that Dorn is onto something. There is a process. You begin in the void, the shadow here at the bottom, and you work your way up, doing your shadow work, aligning your balance with the vices, and then you come back down and you align your shadow with the virtues, or the light with the virtues, however you wish to look at it. In the process of that, you discover the Philosopher's Stone, which is actually your heart. That is the beginning of the second part of the process. And so I'm once again in agreement with Dorn. For us, the representation of the idea of the self as actual and visible is a mere, For us, the representation of the idea of the self in actual and visible form is a mere right d'entrée, as it were, a propaedeutic action and a mere anticipation of its realization. This is a word that is not in common vernacular. This just means an introduction or an introductory course would be a better way of saying it. The existence of a sense of inner security by no means proves that the product will be stable enough to withstand the disturbing or hostile influences of the environment. The adept had to experience again and again how unfavorable circumstances, or a technical blunder, or, as it seemed to him, some devilish accident hindered the completion of his work. Blaming the devil for the evil things is part of that victim mentality that we talk about so very often. You make the decisions. If there is a devil, he is merely a tempter. He is merely the voice that tries to lead you down the wrong road. You have to make the decision to do so. He is not responsible for your decisions. So that he was forced to start all over again from the very beginning. Anyone who submits his sense of inner security to analogous psychic tests will have similar experiences. More than once, everything he has built will fall to pieces under the impact of reality, and he must not let this discourage him from examining, again and again, where it is that his attitude is still defective and what are the blind spots in his psychic field of vision. That I absolutely agree with. It is a continual process. Every single step along the way is just going to blow your mind. Right? Every single time you make any advance in balancing through your vices, you will discover how much more there is to it. Just as the lapis philosophorum, with its miraculous powers, was never produced, so psychic wholeness will never be attained empirically, as consciousness is too narrow and too one-sided to comprehend the full inventory of the psyche. See, just as the lapis philosophorum was never produced is not true, right? It is in physicality. It is in materiality. There has been no produced stone which changes one element into another. There is, however, the psychic stone, which is this green one right here in the middle. That is the lapis. That is the lapis philosophorum. That is the stone of life. That is the key to the sword of discernment. Right? All of that is true. And it has been produced. Dorn did it. Right? That is obvious from this text. Not even Dorn's text. We will be getting to that, but for now, just from what has been written about Dorn in here, lets us know that he did this, right? He actually achieved this. And then he tried to create it in real life because of a misguided association of the as above, so below concept, which is not all encompassing. And so this did happen. In addition to Dorn, I have done so, right? I do not claim to be a master, but I am at least an adept. I am well on the way. I have produced physical results from my mental alchemy. See any of the other videos. But in agreement with Jung here, psychic wholeness will never be attained empirically. Empirically means provable to other people. That is something that is not going to be possible. You being able to prove your self-balance empirically is just not going to happen. Somebody will always be able to find something wrong. Again, with the never attained, right? But in addition to that, consciousness is too narrow and too one-sided to comprehend the full inventory. You only say that because you never produced the lapis, right? Now, I'm not trying to say that I have a full, perfect grasp of all of the concepts that is the psyche. What I am trying to say is that I have the capacity, through the understanding that I have achieved on the process of creating the stone, that I can comprehend anything that pops up in my psyche. I have already gone through and investigated the monster that was me and turned it into the being that I want to be. That does not mean that I am perfect, or that I have attained perfection, or that I ever will attain perfection. But I have now set that as my goal because of the path that I am upon. I am working emphatically towards that, even if I will never achieve that. And I do have the capacity to look objectively at the things that are risen about me, right? And so I don't agree with that. That the consciousness is too narrow and too one-sided, except for the word full, right? Because while there is a vast array of things that I believe that I can conceive, that doesn't mean that there is not something outside of that that can blindside me, right? That doesn't mean that I won't be able to get there even if I am blindsided, but it may not be obvious. It may be something that I never attain. You have to be able to keep that in your mind. And so in part, I agree with this, but in part, I absolutely do not. Always, we shall have to begin again from the beginning. That I do not agree with at all. It is a process, and if you are doing it correctly, you don't go backwards. I mean, you might take a step backwards, but you don't go back to the starting line. From ancient times, the adept knew that he was concerned with the rex simplex. And the modern man, too, will find by experience that the work does not prosper without the greatest simplicity. But simple things are always the most difficult. I say that this is simple, right? The steps that are outlined in here are simple. The book is not long. That is intentional. There is laid out as simply as I possibly can the steps that I have taken to attain. So I don't know that they are the most difficult, right? It can be difficult to understand that that's all you need. Back to the text. The one and simple is what Dorn called the unus mundus. This one world was the rex simplex. 228. In the Liber Platonis Quartorum, this is the term for the arcane substance. The arcane substance is going to be the Holy Spirit, sulfurious, mercurius, right, sulfur. For him, the third and highest degree of conjunction was the union of the whole man with the unus mundus. By this he meant, as we have seen, the potential world of the first day of creation when nothing was yet in actu. An example divided into two and many, but was still one. Footnote 229. Similarly, Aquinas conceives the primal materia as ons et potentia. Now, once again, I am going to point out my own, right? I have a video that will be linked in the corner up here called The Divine and the Trinity Explained. It is me reading aloud chapter 1 of this book, but the concept is this. Before the beginning there was God, and God was infinite and without form. the void. God decided to create and became the creation, limiting himself from the infinite into the finite. That is the spirit. God exists outside of the creation, but the entirety of creation is God. That moment when he limited himself from the infinite into the finite and the spirit was created, all of the elements that are in existence were created at that point. But they were all in stasis, completely still. No combinations as of yet. And then God said, let there be light. Or actually what he said was, I am the light. And he became the light, and the light was good. If that is confusing to you, fall back to Genesis, because that is what God said, according to that particular book, which may or may not have weight in the long term. But when he spoke and said, I am the light, he became the light, and the light was good. That was the Logos. That was setting that stasis, that moment of everything existing but not yet moving, into motion. And then we got heat, we got light, we got vibration and motion and change. All of that is the Logos. No one particular person ever at any time, but instead all of creation changing at the exact same time. That is the Logos. This is the exact same thing. This is a different way of saying what I just stated, right? The potential world of the first day of creation was nothing yet in Act 2, right? In Act 2 is the after the light, when the accretion begins, when the simple elements combine into molecules and they combine into compounds and mixtures. The accretion of the solar systems and the suns, all of that was at the moment of Logos, right? Or began at the moment of Logos. And this is saying the exact same thing. Divided into two and many, right? The light and the dark and all of the elements, but was still one, the Holy Spirit. I am in exact agreement with this. Even though it is not termed the same way that I do, it is exactly what I'm talking about. The footnote said the exact same thing. Back to the text. The creation of unity by a magical procedure meant the possibility of effecting a union with the world. Not with the world of multiplicity as we see it, but with a potential world. The eternal ground of all empirical being, just as the self is the ground and origin of the individual personality, past, present, and future. On the basis of a self known by meditation and produced by alchemical means, Dorn hoped and expected to be united with the Unus Mundus, and I am of the opinion that he did achieve that. This potential world with the Mundus Archetypus of the schoolmen. I conjecture that the immediate model for Dorn's idea is to be found in Philo Judaeus, who in his treatise De Mundi Opificio, footnote 230, Philo's writings were available in the Latin edition of Petronilius and may have been known to Dorn, who wrote in 1590. De Mundi Opificio says that the Creator made the intelligible world, an incorporeal heaven, an invisible earth, and the idea of the air and the void. That would be the beginning, right? Made in the intelligible world, which is inside of the creation, an incorporeal heaven, that is the void, right? Without form would be incorporeal. An invisible earth and the idea of air and the void. Now that is the elements before accretion. Last of all, he created man, a little heaven that bears in itself the reflections of many natures similar to the stars. Now this is part of that anthropomorphication. We do not know that we were the last created. I mean, we assume that because of our pride. We do not know that God looks like us. We assume that because of our pride. We do not know that God is motivated in the same ways that we are. We assume that because of our pride. And so this may or may not be true. We do not know. Nobody will know while you are here. Here, Philo points clearly to the idea of the microcosm and hence to the unity of the psychic man with the cosmos. According to Philo, the relation to the Creator, to the mundus intelligibilis, is the imago, or archetypus, of the relation of the mind to the body. Whether Dorn also knew Plotinus is questionable. In his fourth Ennead, Plotinus discusses the problem of whether all individuals are merely one soul, and he believes he has good grounds for affirming this question. All right, now, here's the thing about that, right? We're going to use the pen again. I use the pen analogy because it is easier than using a coin, right? There is one end that is you, it is the ego, it is the part making the decisions, the soul. On the other end, you have God, right? Now, your soul is an individualized portion of God. Given this meat suit, this 5D navigation device that is the temple to reside in, the spirit allows the temple to do all of the things. This end is you thinking and making decisions, and this end is still connected to the divine. You hear through this end the Holy Spirit giving you suggestions. Some of those suggestions are positive, some of them are negative. They both come from the same source. Which one you hear depends upon which one you feed. You begin with a small amount of consciousness and a greater amount of unconsciousness, and through the physical exertion, the actually doing the work, you can increase that to a certain degree into the unconscious where you can understand those things that I was talking about before. You will never fully reach here because this is still God, and you will not get there here, right? The other key thing to remember is this is you, right? This is you individualized into your temple of God from the source. But if you tilt this, right, this is someone else. This is someone else right here, still attached to God. And then if you tilt it a little bit more, this is someone else, and this is still attached to God. That is one soul, right? Now, we are each individualized into our own experience, but we all come from the exact same source. And so there are good grounds for affirming this question. I mentioned Plotinus because he is an earlier witness to the idea of the unus mundus. The unity of the soul rests empirically on the basic psychic structure common to all souls, which, though not visible and tangible like the anatomical structure, is just as evident as it. The thought Dorn expresses by the third degree of conjunction is universal. It is the relation or identity of the personal with the superpersonal Atman, and of the individual Tao with the universal Tao. I just explained that entire concept. To the Westerner, this view appears not at all realistic and all too mystic. Above all, he cannot see why a self should become a reality when it enters into relationship with the world of the first day of creation. He has no knowledge of any other world than the empirical one. Strictly speaking, his puzzlement does not begin here. It already began with the production of the Caleb, the inner unity. Such thoughts are unpopular and distressingly nebulous. He does not know where they belong or on what they could be based. They might be true, or again, they might not. In short, his experience stops here, and with it, as a rule, his understanding, and, unfortunately, only too often, his willingness to learn more. I would therefore counsel the critical reader to put aside his prejudices and, for once, try to experience on himself the effects of the process I have described, or else to suspend judgment and admit that he understands nothing. For 30 years I have studied these psychic processes under all possible conditions, and have assured myself that the alchemists, as well as the great philosophies of the East, are referring to just such experiences, and that it is chiefly our ignorance of the psyche if these experiences appear mystic. We should, at all events, be able to understand that the visualization of the self is a window into eternity, which gave the medieval man, like the Oriental, an opportunity to escape from the stifling grip of a one-sided view of the world or to hold out against it. And it is funny when you see the centrics, right? This is Eurocentric, and you can tell because did nobody live in the Orient during the medieval times? Though the goal of the opus alchemicum is indubitably the production of the lapis or calum, there can be no doubt about its tendency to spiritualize the body. That is because it is a spiritual process by which the lapis is produced. This is expressed by the symbol of the air-colored liquid that floats to the surface. It represents nothing less than a corpus glorificationius, the resurrected body whose relation to eternity is self-evident. Now, just as it seems self-evident to the naive-minded person that an apple falls from the tree to the earth, but absurd to say that the earth rises up to meet the apple, so he can believe without difficulty that the mind is able to spiritualize the body without being affected by its inertia and grossness. But all effects are mutual, and nothing changes anything else without itself being changed. Although the alchemist thought he knew better than anyone else that, at the creation, at least a little bit of the divinity, the anima mundi, entered into material things and was caught there, he nevertheless believed in the possibility of a one-sided spiritualization, without considering that the precondition for this materialization of spirit in the form of the blue quintessence. In reality, his labors elevated the body into proximity with the spirit, while at the same time drawing the spirit down into matter. By sublimating matter, he concretized spirit. This self-evident truth was still strange to the medieval man, and it has only been partially digested even by the man of today. But if a union is to take place between opposites like spirit and matter, conscious and unconscious, bright and dark, and so on, it will happen in a third thing, which represents not a compromise but something new. Just as for the alchemist, the cosmic strife of the elements was composed by the stone that is no stone, by a transcendental entity that could be described only in paradoxes. Not paradoxes, contraries, right? Two sides of the same coin, light and dark, good and evil, creation, destruction. Same coin. There is acts being taken in all of them, but those acts are opposite sides of the same thing. Love, wrath, gluttony, temperance, or denial, right? These things are diametrically opposed, completely opposite of one another, but shades of one another. Footnote 231. Let's go ahead and look at that. The antiquity of the stone symbolism is shown by the fact that it occurs not only among primitives living today, but in the documents of ancient cultures as well. As, for instance, in the Hurrian text of Bagaskoi, where the son of the father Kumarbi is the son Ulikumi, a terrible diorite stone that grew in the water. This stone parallels the Greek myth of the stone which Cronus swallowed and spat out again when Zeus compelled him to yield up the children he had devoured. Zeus then set up as a cult object in Pytho. Ulikumi is a titanic being and, interestingly enough, an implacable enemy of the gods. Dorn's calum, which corresponded to the stone, was on the one hand a liquid that could be poured out of a bottle, and on the other, the microcosm itself. The bottle is internal, right? The liquid is internal. It is not physical. I mean, it is, but it is an internal physicality. For the psychologist, it is the self, man, as he is, and the indescribable and super-empirical totality of that same man. This totality is a mere postulate, but a necessary one, because no one can assert that he has complete knowledge of man as he is. I agree with that. Even though I have a better than normal understanding of myself, I do not claim to have a complete understanding. Not only in the psychic man is there something unknown, but also in the physical. We should be able to include this unknown quantity in a total picture of man, but we cannot. Man himself is partly empirical, partly transcendental. He, too, is the stone with no stone. Also, we do not know whether what we on the empirical plane regard as physical may not, in the unknown beyond our experience, be identical with what on this side of the border we distinguish from the psychical as psychic. Though we know from experience that psychic processes are related to material ones, we are not in a position to say in what this relationship consists or how it is possible at all. Precisely because the psychic and the physical are mutually dependent, it has often been conjectured that they may be identical somewhere beyond our present experience, though this certainly does not justify the arbitrary hypothesis of either materialism or spiritualism. With this conjecture of the identity of the psychic and physical, we approach the alchemical view of the unus mundus, the potential world of the first day of creation, when there was as yet no second. Again, that moment of stasis. Before the time of Paracelsus, the alchemists believed in creatio ex nihilo. For them, therefore, God himself was the principle of matter. Paracelsus did not have the correct understanding, but I do agree with this, right? God himself is the principle of matter. But Paracelsus and his school assumed that matter was an increatum, and hence coexistent and co-eternal with God. Whether they considered this view monistic or dualistic, I am unable to discover. The only certain thing is that for all the alchemists, matter had a divine aspect, whether on the ground that God was imprisoned in it, in the form of the anima mundi, or anima media natura, or that matter represented God's reality. In no case was matter de-deified, and certainly not the potential matter of the first day of creation. It seems that only the Paracelsus were influenced by the dualistic words of Genesis. Wait a second. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this because we have not done it before. I'm going to just look and see what the dates are, right? Okay, so this is the 1400s, the 1500s. Well, that absolutely makes sense. I thought that he was pre-existent too, right? I was thinking that this was prior to zero, which would have thrown that whole thing off, right? But it's not. I am wrong. Monistic or dualistic, right? The difference between that is just a viewpoint, right? If you look at there is only one God, that is monistic. If you look at God has two forms, that is dualistic. If you look at it as the mother and father, that is dualistic. But the way that I look at it is God is the Holy Spirit, right? God is the one, the thing from which all things were created. He exists outside of the creation. We do not have definable limits on God. And he created us. He created creation, limiting himself from the infinite into the finite, right? That is becoming the dualistic. You're already separating yourself from the finite or from the infinite into the finite, but the finite has a dualistic nature, positive and negative, light and dark, male and female, however you want to identify it. That is dualistic, but that is not oppositional to the monistic view, right? I serve the one true God, the creator of all things, he who was, is, and always shall be. I serve him through the Spirit, which is creation, by the guidance of the Spirit, which is the voice that you hear, for the creation, which is everything that is in existence all at the exact same time. And so it is not impossible to reconcile both the monistic view and the dualistic view. And as a matter of fact, that almost certainly defines where Socrates was when he died. If you are unaware, as far as I know, Socrates was the first person to die for the one true God, right? He was in opposition to the people of Greece in Athens about their gods, right? He was teaching that there was a God, but it was not the gods that they said, right? And that's why he died. The only certain thing is that for all the alchemists, matter had a divine aspect, whether on the ground that God was imprisoned in it in the form of the anima mundi or the anima media natura. And again, imprisoned in it is victim mentality. Anytime that you see it, it is a misrepresentation. In no case was matter knowing. Dualistic words of Genesis 2:3-2. Genesis 1:2. And earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God brooded over the deep. And then God spoke and said, I am the light, and became the light, and the light was good. That's how it reads. Fall back to Genesis. If Dorn, then, saw the consummation of the Mysterium Conjuntionis in the union of the alchemically produced Calum with the Unus Mundus, he expressly meant not a fusion of the individual with his environment or even his adaptation to it, but a unio mystica with the potential world. Such a view, indeed, seems to us mystical if we misuse this word in its pejorative modern sense. It is not, however, a question of thoughtlessly used words, but of a view which can be translated from medieval language into modern concepts. Undoubtedly, the idea of the Unus Mundus is founded on the assumption that the multiplicity of the empirical world rests on an underlying unity, and that not two or more fundamentally different worlds exist side by side or are mingled with one another. Rather, everything divided and different belongs to one and the same world, which is not the world of sense but a postulate whose probability is vouched for by the fact that until now no one has been able to discover a world in which the known laws of nature are invalid. That even the psychic world, which is so extraordinarily different from the physical world, does not have its roots outside the one cosmos is evident from the undeniable fact that causal connections exist between the psyche and the body, which point to their underlying unitary nature. You are here as a single unit, but you are composed of the three parts: body, the temple of God; soul, the individualization of God that navigates the temple; and the spirit, which allows that navigation to happen. That is necessarily Trinitarian, but it is also Unitarian. The number of manifestation is 138 for a reason. All that is not encompassed by our knowledge, so that we are not in a position to make any statements about its total nature. Microphysics is feeling its way into the unknown side of matter, just as complex psychology is pushing forward into the unknown side of the psyche. Both lines of investigation have yielded findings which can be conceived only by the means of antinomies, and both have developed concepts which display remarkable analogies. If this trend should become more pronounced in the future, the hypotheses of the unity of their subject matters would gain in probability. Of course, there is little or no hope that the unitary being can ever be conceived, since our powers of thought and language permit only an antinomian statements. But this much we do know beyond all doubt, that empirical reality has a transcendental background, a fact which, as Sir James Jones has shown, can be expressed by Plato's parable of the cave. The parable of the cave is a wonderful thing to explore. I have done so for you. The common background of the microphysics and depth psychology is as much a physical as psychic, and therefore neither, but rather a third thing, a neutral nature which can at most be grasped in hints, since its essence is transcendental. The background of our empirical world thus appears to be in fact a unus mundus. This is at least a probable hypothesis which satisfies the fundamental tenet of scientific theory. Explanatory principles are not to be multiplied beyond the necessary. The transcendental psychophysical background corresponds to a potential world, insofar as all those conditions which determine the form of empirical phenomena are inherent in it. This obviously holds good as much for physics as for psychology, or to be more precise, for macrophysics as much as for the psychology of consciousness. So, if Dorn sees the third and highest degree of conjunction in a union or relationship of the adept who has produced the calum with the unus mundus, this would consist, psychologically, in the synthesis of the conscious with the unconscious. The result of this conjunction or equation is theoretically inconceivable, since a known quality is combined with an unknown one. Consciousness, unconsciousness. Just for reference. But in practice, as many far-reaching changes of consciousness result from it as atomic physics has produced in classical physics. The nature of the changes which Dorn expects from the third stage of the Conjunctio can be established only indirectly from the symbolism used by the adepts. What he called the Kalim is, as we have seen, a symbolic prefiguration of the self. We can conclude from this that the desired realization of the whole man was conceived as a healing of organic and psychic ills. Since the Kalim was described as a universal medicine, the panacea, a lexopharmac, medicina catholica, etc., it was regarded also as the balsam and elixir of life, as a life-prolonging, strengthening, and rejuvenating magical potion. It was a living stone, a batilus, a stone that hath a spirit. 233. Berthelot. And the living stone mentioned in the New Testament. 234. 1 Peter 2:5. Like living stones be yourselves built into spiritual edifice. Ephesians 2:20. I would have to look at the entire context to make sure that that was actually talking about this. There is a severe tendency to misattribute things to the Testaments. But I am not in disagreement with all of this so far, right? The things that I talk about here is what he is talking about there. This literally is the stone. When you go up, you get the ability to formulate the stone. Then you come back down, so that is 1, 2, 3. It is a 3-step process. I am in conjunction with that. That is a trinity after all. It is also the medicine. It is the thing that has allowed me to heal myself in 4 different ways. It is the stone that hath the spirit. You do reside there. It is a living stone. It does change. All of this I am in agreement with, except where it gets to this part, because this is not a good reference most of the time. And the living stone mentioned in the New Testament, which in the Shepherd of Hermas is a living man, who adds himself as a brick to the tower of the church. Above all, its incorruptibility is stressed. It lasts a long time, or for all eternity. Though alive, it is unmoved. It radiates magic power and transforms the perishable into the imperishable, and the impure into the pure. It multiplies itself indefinitely. It is simple and therefore universal, the union of all opposites. It is the parallel of Christ and is called the Savior of the macrocosm. And again, you lost me in that part. But the Kalim also signifies man's likeness to God, imago Dei. That is an assumption. There is no reason to believe that God looks like you any more than he looks like a dog or a cat. All of them are creations of God. The only thing that makes us think that God has our image is pride. The anima mundi and matter and the truth itself. It has 1,000 names. That is true. We have gone through several of them in this study. It is also the microcosm, the whole man, Chinyan, a homunculus, and a hermaphrodite. These designations and significations are but a small selection from the plethora of names mentioned in the literature. Not unnaturally, we are at a loss to see how a psychic experience of this kind, for such it evidently was, can be formulated as a rational concept. I've got a book for that. I wish he was around to read it. Literally, I do. Undoubtedly, it was meant as the essence of perfection and universality, and as such, it's characterized an experience of similar proportions. We could compare this only with the ineffable mystery of the Unio Mystica, or Tao, or the content of Samadhi, or the experience of Satori in Zen, which would bring us to the realm of the ineffable and of extreme subjectivity, where all the criterion of reason fail. Remarkably enough, this experience is an empirical one in as so far as there are unanimous testimonies from the East and West alike, both from the present and from the distant past, which confirm its unsurpassable subjective significance. Our knowledge of physical nature gives us no point d'appui, which that would enable us to put the experience on any generally valid basis. It is, and remains, a secret of the world of psychic experience, and can only be understood as a numinous event, whose actuality, nevertheless, cannot be doubted any more than the fact that light of a certain wavelength is perceived as red, a fact which remains incomprehensible only to a man suffering from red-green blindness. It is good that you put in that there is a wavelength, because everything is a harmonic, after all. What, then, do the statements of the alchemists concerning their arcana mean, looked at psychologically? In order to answer this question, we must remember the working hypothesis we have used for the interpretation of dreams. The images in dreams and spontaneous fantasies are symbols. That is, the best possible formulation for still unknown or unconscious facts, which generally compensate the content of consciousness or the conscious attitude. If we apply this basic rule to the alchemical arcanum, we come to the conclusion that its most concuspious quality, namely its unity and uniqueness, one is the stone, one the medicine, one the vessel, one the procedure, and one the disposition. Footnote 235. That is from the Philosophica. Presupposes a disassociated consciousness. For no one who is one himself needs oneness as a medicine. You are not oneness of yourself, right? You come into accordance with the oneness that is, right? All that is in existence is quite literally the same thing. It is the Holy Spirit. And all of the elements are the Holy Spirit. You, as an individual, are comprised entirely from the elements that were existent prior to your conception. You are added to along the way by various elements that you consume, but all of those elements were existent prior to you. You merely assimilated to yourself. That is the oneness, right? It is not necessarily you, right? You are the individualized piece of the oneness. The oneness is existent outside of you. You, through meditative practices and prayer and fasting and those things, can come into accordance with the oneness. You can get to the point where you lose yourself into the creation. That is part of the process. That is the oneness. But it's not you literally going into the one. It is you becoming aware of it. You becoming part of it by the awareness that you are a part of it. That is what was described. That is what was talked about. That is the medicine. The thing that has healed me is the going up and back down the stack. It is creating the stone, but is the completion of the process. The acceptance, even, of the process. Every single key step along the way for my physical healing has been from an acknowledgement of a step along this way. And so, once again, Jung just doesn't have the key, right? He never achieved the third step, at least. I don't think he got to the second step, really. He began the first step. I don't know that he even finished that. Nor, we might add, does anyone who is unconscious of his disassociation for a conscious situation of distress is needed in order to activate the archetype of unity. From this, we may conclude that the more philosophically minded alchemists were people who did not feel satisfied with the then prevailing view of the world, that is, with the Christian faith. And that I will agree with emphatically. But they had no choice but to use that language, because if they did not use that language, they got to die, quite horrifically in most cases. With the Christian faith, although they were convinced of its truth, they were not. They lied for the sake of saving their life. In this latter respect, we find it in the classical Latin and Greek literature of alchemy no evidences to the contrary, but rather, so far as Christian treatises are concerned, abundant testimony to the firmness of their Christian convictions. And once again, I will point out that Christianity spread by the sword. Right? It began with Constantine. It did not end when they came to the New World. Right? If you did not believe, you had two choices. You could renounce what you didn't believe and follow this new thing, or you could die. It was literally that simple. You got to choose. And so, of course, they used the language that would allow them to live. That is the whole reason why there were secret societies. Since Christianity is expressly a system of salvation, victim mentality, founded moreover on God's plan of redemption, victim mentality, and God is unity par excellence, that part I agree with, one must ask oneself why the alchemists still felt a disunity in themselves and not at one with themselves, when their faith, so it would appear, gave them every opportunity for unity and unison. And I just explained that, right? Death. Death is the reason why it appears that they were not satisfied. Because they were not. They were just not allowed to express that. The question has lost nothing of its topicality today. On the contrary, the question answers itself when we examine more closely the other attributes that are predicated on the arcanum. The next quality, therefore, which we have to consider is its physical nature. Although the alchemists attached the greatest importance to this, and the stone was the whole raison d'etre of their art, yet it cannot be regarded as a merely physical, since it is stressed that the stone was alive and possessed a soul and spirit, and even that it was a man, or some creature like a man. And although it was also said of God that the world is his physical manifestation, this pantheistic view was rejected by the church. That is true and stupid, right? It is not pantheistic to say that God created creation. How is that pantheistic? Is that placing into many theisms the need for that? Not at all. If you say that God is quite literally everything in existence, that is monotheistic. To an nth degree, much more so than Christianity is, much more so than Judaism was. That is stupid. Now, that is intrinsically because the Catholic Church was stupid, but for God is spirit and the very reverse of matter. There are two forces. In that case, the Christian standpoint would correspond to the unio mentalis and the overcoming of the body. So far as the alchemist professed the Christian faith, he knew that according to his own lights, he was still at the second stage of conjunction, and that the Christian truth was not yet realized. The soul was drawn up by the spirit to the lofty regions of abstraction, but the body was desouled, and since it also had claims to live, the unsatisfactoriness of the situation could not remain hidden from him. He was unable to feel himself a whole, and whatever the spiritualization of his existence may have meant to him, he could not get beyond the here and now of his bodily life in the physical world. The spirit precluded his orientation to physics, and vice versa. Despite all assurances to the contrary, Christ is not a unifying factor but a dividing sword, which sunders the spiritual man from the physical. The alchemists, who, unlike certain moderns, were clever enough to see the necessity and fitness of a further development of consciousness, held fast to their Christian convictions and did not slip back to a more unconscious level. They could not and would not deny the truth of Christianity, and for this reason it would be wrong to accuse them of heresy. This is the exact reason why they would not. Right? I stand upon that. We have seen that from the studies. Right? And right, I have done the Bible study. This is not a thing. It is simply not. Fall back if you would like to understand more. I have read through, there were 161 videos of me reading through the Bible. On the contrary, they wanted to realize the unity foreshadowed in the idea of God by struggling to unite the unio mentalis with the body. The mainspring of this endeavor was the conviction that this world was in a morbid condition and that everything was corrupted by original sin. Yeah, that is the mainspring, and that is another one of those intrinsic misconceptions. Right? We've talked about it so often in this study that I'm not going to hit it again, but there are at least 3 problems with original sin. Fall back to the other parts of the study for that. They saw that the soul could be redeemed only if it was freed by the spirit from its natural attachment to the body, although this neither altered nor in any way improved the status of physical life. The microcosm, in example the inner man, was capable of redemption, but not the corrupt body. God created the body. God created your body. This insight was reason enough for a disassociation of consciousness in a spiritual and physical personality. They could all declare with St. Paul, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of death?" There's that victim mentality again. 2:36. Romans 7:24. They therefore strove to find the medicine that would heal all the sufferings of the body and the disunion of the soul. The Greek word, which frees the body of its corruptibility, and the elixir vitae, which grants the long life of the biblical aforetime, or even immortality. You will not achieve immortality. It will not happen. Not physically, not in the corporeal world. Your soul is already eternal. You cannot grant your soul eternality, and you cannot achieve immortality here in the earthly plane. Since most of them were physicians, they had plenty of opportunities to form an overwhelming impression of the transitoriness of human existence, and to develop that kind of impatience which refuses to wait till kingdom come for more endurable conditions, better in accord with the message of salvation. It is precisely the claims of the physical man and the unendurability of his dissociation that are expressed in this gnawing discontent. The alchemists consequently saw themselves faced with the extremely difficult task of uniting the wayward physical man with his spiritual truth. As they were neither unbelievers nor heretics, they could not and would not alter this truth in order to make it more favorably disposed to the body. And again, they had no choice. I mean, they did, but it was a bad choice, right? Either you admit this thing or you die. That's a terrible choice. Besides, the body was in the wrong anyway, since it had succumbed to original sin by its moral weakness. Again, that is just stupid. It was therefore the body with its darkness that had to be prepared. This, as we have seen, was done by extracting a quintessence which was the physical equivalent of heaven, of the potential world, and on that account was named Calum. It was the very essence of the body, an incorruptible and therefore pure and eternal substance, a corpus glorificatum, capable and worthy of being united with the unio mentalis. What was left over from the body was a terra damnata, a dross, that had to be abandoned to its fate. The quintessence, the calum, on the other hand, corresponded to the pure, incorrupt original stuff of the world, God's adequate and perfectly obedient instrument, whose production therefore permitted the alchemist to hope and expect the conjunction with the unus mundus. This solution was a compromise to the disadvantage of physis, but it was nevertheless a noteworthy attempt to bridge the disassociation between spirit and matter. It was not a solution of principle, for the very reason that the procedure did not take place in the real object at all, but was a fruitless projection, since the calum could never be fabricated in reality. And once again, we come to the entire problem that Jung had. It was a hope that was extinguished with alchemy, and then, it seems, was struck off of the agenda forever. But the disassociation remained, and in quite the contrary sense brought about a far better knowledge of nature and a sounder medicine, while on the other hand it deposed the spirit in a manner that would paralyze Dorn with horror, could he see it today. The elixir vitae of modern science has already increased the expectation of life very considerably in hopes for still better results in the future. It will never be immortality. And we have, right? Through pharmacopoeia, we have increased life. Whether that is good or not is up for debate. The unio mentalis, on the other hand, has become a pale phantom, and the veritas Christiana feels itself on the defensive. As for a truth that is hidden in the human body, there is no longer any talk of that. There is nowadays. As history has remorselessly made good with the alchemical compromise left unfinished. The physical man has been unexpectedly thrust into the foreground and has conquered nature in an undreamt of way. At the same time, he has become conscious of his empirical psyche, which has loosened itself from the embrace of the spirit and begun to take on so concrete a form that its individual features are now the object of clinical observation. It has long ceased to be a life principle of some kind of philosophical abstraction. On the contrary, it is suspected of being a mere epiphenomenon of the chemistry of the brain, nor does the spirit any longer give it life. Rather, it is conjectured that the spirit owes its existence to psychic activity. That is exactly wrong. Today, psychology can call itself a science, and this was a big concession on the part of the spirit. What demands psychology will make on the other natural sciences, and on physics in particular, only the future can tell. And that is going to bring us to the end of part 9. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult series of topics. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but I do not apologize for it. I have the references, right? I have done the work. All of the things that I state, I do not state idly. None of them, not a single one of them, is stated without due consideration, even though it happens fairly rapidly. I am firmly established in the things that I understand, right? I am willing to be corrected, but that correction has to come with a greater understanding, not a reversion to a lesser understanding. If you have not been through the Bible study, or if you do not know where I stand on those particular things, the first 2 videos will get you there, right? The other 161 videos is the literal process of getting there, right? The first video is why the Bible cannot be an authority. The second one is what instead of. Then we get into the study that led me to the conclusions that are those first 2 videos. I understand that that is contentious to a lot of people. That is why I end this with stating that I don't care if I step on your toes, right? I have done the work. I do not speak idly about these things. I have spent an extensive amount of time on it, and the views that I hold did not come about lightly. It took some extreme reflection upon my part, understanding the obstacles that were in my way, doing the shadow work that actually led to those conclusions, to put aside the preconceived notions of religiosity and to look at it as the source material that it is intended to be. And as the source material, it is severely flawed. And not just a little bit, like a lot. Like a lot. You have to go to school specifically to learn how to apologize for those inconsistencies. That is the reason why it has lasted so long, because people go to school to learn how to apologize for the inconsistencies. But those apologies do not make sense in context of the book itself. And therefore, that is the problem that you probably have with anything that was stated here. Again, I refer you to the Bible study. That's going to bring us to the end. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, or follow. Throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated, put it in the box down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership. picking up a copy of my book where I talk about these things in some detail, or contacting me directly or supporting the channel directly through the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pittstake. Peace.